Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Hi, my name is John Learned. I'm a sometimes freelance games writer, sometimes Twitch streamer, sometimes YouTuber. You can find my stuff all over the internet. I'm all over the place. I'm the guy that did the annotated Symphony of the Night and the annotated Third Strike, and you should watch those because they almost killed me. Anyway, speaking of killing, we need to talk about Demon Souls. And by Demon Souls, I mean the original and remake of FromSoft's 2009 PS3 dungeon crawly RPG that basically set the tone for a lot of video game genre that came thereafter. Dark Souls, famously the sequel to spiritual sequel to the game, and then all of the other Souls-likes that came thereafter are basically built on the concepts from this game. And those concepts have carried through in such a way that it's kind of incredible that not much has changed, but so much has changed around them. And I think it's worth getting into that stuff. And it's worth sort of just, falling in love with this game all over again, even if you haven't played it in a long time, even if you've stayed away from it for so long, because it is so different from the later Souls-like games and the genre that it sort of birthed by itself, that it is a real gem. And I think it's worth explaining the game first before we get into my experiences with it, which I know is part of the deal for this podcast, but you'll get why in a second. So, again, Demon Souls came out in 2009, developed by FromSoft, who at that point was a real C-lister as far as game developers were concerned, a workman-like game studio that has since evolved way past that and is one of the more important video game design studios in the modern era. For the PS3, it was a famously troubled development, which began as sort of an answer to Oblivion, the Elder Scrolls, and when it was sort of falling apart, a gentleman named Hidetaka Miyazaki came in to save it, a person that came from the business world and decided to sort of move into video game development sort of mid to late career, and has evolved video game design in such a way that his name is pretty close to household at this point. And if you're listening to this show, then you have probably heard of him. Taking place in the northern country of Boletaria, Demon Souls opens up with a sort of sparse crawl of dialogue with some still images that sort of detail how this kingdom had acquired and had learned these sort of nebulous soul arts, and how their greed, this king's greed, had sort of led them to ruin and awoken an old god that we call the Old One. And the Old One basically formed a colorless fog around this kingdom and its surrounding areas, drove all the people there insane, and propagated armies of demons to come out of it. You are a character that you create that breaks through the colorless fog, as other people have tried to do, and you run into some of them in the game to, at first, sort of find fame and fortune, but as the game goes on, and depending on your level of interest in it, sort of uncover the darker secrets of what's really happening here, what the Old One is, how it is, its relationship with the people of Boletaria and the people of the world. And that is really interesting storytelling that, like the other Souls games, is not straightforward. It is not fed to you in such a way. There are NPCs that you can meet very early on that give you lots of flavor dialogue, lots of context around what's happening. There is an ending to the game. There are actually two endings to the game. You don't really know that there's a second ending at the point of conclusion, but there is an ending to the game that gives you some very brief sort of closure to what a quote good ending would be. But digging a little deeper, this is the game that sort of made a treasure hunt out of finding what the story is, and the smaller stories that are presented to you from the other NPCs and the NPCs that you find within the world. And the world itself is fascinating. It is a game that is basically a level design dungeon crawler, level by level dungeon crawler that you can tackle in almost any order that you want after you finish the tutorial, if it's your first time, and then after you finish the first level, which the faithful colloquially just call 1-1. It's not like the other Souls games in that it's not an interconnected world. There are 5 discrete levels that are basically one long tunnel, and each level has 3 to 4 levels within it. So you finish 1-1, you can go into 1-2 if you want, which is the next section of that tunnel, or you can move on to 2-1 or 3-1 or what have you. And a lot of the fun of the game is that if you're the kind of person that really likes to tinker and figure out ways to destroy something, ways to sort of blast through a game, something that you can learn, you can adapt to, then you can sort of plot your journey out according to what kind of build that you make. But you don't really know that your first time through. But the fun thing, and one of the great things about this game, is that how its community, even very, very early on, really embraced that level of not knowing. So the Souls games have sort of garnered two reputations. One for being extremely difficult, which we're going to get back to, and one for being extremely opaque. And Demon Souls itself was a little less opaque than some of the other games in certain ways, but very opaque in a lot of ways specific to this game because of its design and level by level nature. The Japanese crowd, when it was released on the PS3 in Japan, really dug into this and it became a huge import scene because of this crazy word of mouth that sort of grew out of it, and how the players were sort of sharing ideas and sharing tactics and sharing what they had found in the world and how you can manipulate the world to making it less or more evil. And that really kind of bred out a certain fourth grade playground play style, if you know what I mean. It's people sharing information, writing down what they find, and then making that, I mean, not only does that grow a community around the game, it grows your interest in it, because you never really know if we found everything. You don't know if something else is going to happen in this game that you've never seen before or nobody's seen before. I mean, at this point, we've pretty much unlocked all of that stuff. We've really grokked it. But for the first several years of this, and even past Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, there were still people playing Demon Souls, the original version of it, thinking, there's got to be more to this. There's something else in here that we haven't seen. And that's great. I think that's a lot of fun. Demon Souls is the kind of game that people will hate, and I totally understand that. It is the kind of game where, at least my first experience with it has been pretty much the exact same experience as everyone I've ever met that's gone through it the first time, and that they suffer through it. They sort of learn the mechanics. They dig up what they can find on the internet for some tips and tactics and character build ideas and where certain weapons are and what have you. And then they just force themselves through the game. And then by the end of it, they're like, that's done. I'm never doing this again. But it is the kind of game that will stick in your craw. It's something that you'll remember and think about and mull over for months, if not years afterward, thinking, what if I did this different? What if I built this character different? And if I do that, where can I find powerful weapons early? How can I manipulate the world to get me the things that I want as soon as possible? How can I shatter this game over my knee? And Demon Souls, especially with the way it's structured, again, it is not a Metroidvania or open world like Elden Ring, like Bloodborne, like the other games. Map out what you want to do, where you want to go very early on in your head, and execute the plan and destroy the game with relative ease. It's a very interesting game. And also, it started a lot of trends that we see in a lot of other Souls games that still has not changed whatsoever. There's a giant swamp. In this game, there's a puzzle boss. In Dark Souls 1, there's a puzzle boss. And those have sort of gone away for the for the best. There are boss fights that are somewhat puzzle-like, but not complete puzzles, like the Dragon God. And there are straight-up mano-a-mano, gnarly, get in their face, fight it out, learn the dodge movements. There's those sorts of boss fights too, which are sort of like the common theme for most Souls games now. They evolved into that. They didn't start that way. And what makes these boss fights fun is exactly what I'm talking about with like how you play the game, how you plan the game, how you play it a second time, essentially, to know I can get these items that can do this kind of damage, that can kill this boss in such a way that it will not be a threat to me. And again, I find that a ton of fun. It's a cool game. So now that we've sort of explained it a little bit, we have to talk about my relationship with it. And this is going to be a little bit self-serving. But again, I hated this game when I first played it, but I made it through. And a lot of people's experiences, like I said, are going to be like that. In 2010, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I didn't know what to do with myself. And I was broke. So what do you do when you're broke? If you have video games, you just replay them. It like ad nauseum. You replay them until there's nothing, there's no more blood to squeeze out of a rock. So while I was home sick, recovering from chemo, recovering from radiation, I took it upon myself to annihilate this game. That was my only focus. That is what kept me going. And my weekends were basically me in an apartment, grinding levels in 4-3 with a pure black world tendency, which if you know the game, you know exactly what I'm talking about, just so I could try XYZ, just so I could kill a certain enemy faster, just so I could test out what the build would be like if I did it with this sort of weapon or that sort of spell. And this was at a time in my life where I had just gotten married. We were both working lousy, poorly paying jobs, and I didn't know what my next 6 months were going to be. And this was something that I completely lost myself in. It's not quite fair to say that this game got me through cancer, but this game basically was cancer for me. And I don't know that I love it in a way that other people sort of love certain video games, but because it's such a specific part of my life that it's something that will always be a part of me. Like chunks of my DNA are now wrapped up into this game. So it's one of my favorite video games ever. And I like a lot of video games. I've played a lot of video games. I'm guessing a lot of people that have listened to this podcast have played a lot of video games too. But this is the most representative video game to me, even though I don't love playing it all the time. But I know it backwards and forwards, and I've played it an awful lot, and I've played it an awful lot recently with the remake that came out for the PS5 a couple of years ago, that it is attached to me. And I still think, even though most Souls fans will probably still look at this as a weird curio, especially the way it's built, and especially with some of its more arcane systems that I didn't even get into explaining, I think it's worth playing, not necessarily to suffer through, like I mentioned, but I think for like getting that eerie experience out of it, for finding something that you can sort of struggle to overcome and then circle back to and say, this is not going to be a problem for me anymore. I know how this works. I know how I can work against it. This is a game that makes you acquiesce to the way it wants you to play. And I know that doesn't sound like good design, but it's such a flexible game that you can do all kinds of things with all kinds of different builds and still play the way the game wants you to play. And it trains you to play the other Souls games in that respect, if you're at all interested in that. So I know this is very vague, and I've mentioned this a couple times already, but from a certain perspective, it is the easiest Souls game. From a different perspective, it's maybe the hardest, because they were still sort of working out the kinks of what this nascent genre had become. And I think everyone should give it a shot. So it's easily emulatable if you've got a computer with some beef to it. There is a few really good PS3 emulators out there. I've streamed this game over a PS3 emulator. If you have a PS5, this was a launch PS5 game. The remake is very good. There's a smoothness to it that I think the original game lacks, but an atmosphere shift that the first game I think has a leg up on the remake, but they're still good. It's an accessible game if you have the means to do it, and I think everybody should play this. Not because I was sick and I fucking lived my life playing it, but because I think it's a very fascinating game. And the longer the Souls-like genre sort of evolves and gets larger, it's fun to go back to see how small this feels, but how complex it was and how dense and how textured and atmospheric it really is. This is a remarkably great starting point for where we are in gaming so many years later, 15 years later. So give it a shot. Play Demon Souls. It's a good game. I'm John Learned. Look for me on the internet. Watch my stuff. Listen to more of these shows. Happy gaming.
Do you feel like you're the only person in your circle who wants to go deep about video games regularly?
We were like that too, until now. Welcome to Crossplay Conversations, the brand new bi-weekly topical video game podcast from Luke Lewis,
Joseph Hooper,
and Jacob McCord.
with many years of breaking it down separately on shows like the Left Behind Game Club, Player Podcast, and Lukewarm Games, the gang is finally coming together to publish their gaming group chat in audio form every other week.
Expect roundtable reviews of the latest games, profiles of upcoming indies, and insightful conversations about essential topics in the video game industry. All with a mostly positive, insightful, and fun style.
Crossplay Conversations debuts on August 1st with brand new episodes hitting every other Tuesday. Help us out by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice to get the first episodes delivered straight to your feed.
And follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos for updates about the show.
Cheers
and happy gaming.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.